Good afternoon, and welcome to America's Voice press briefing on the economic impact of mass deportation. Excuse me. My name is Angela Kelley, and I'm a senior advisor to the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and I'll be acting as today's moderator. We'll start with brief presentations and then give folks in the audience plenty of opportunity to ask questions. It's no secret that the tectonic plates of immigration law and policy are about to shift dramatically with the incoming Trump administration. And at the heart of the Trump administration's immigration policy changes appears to be an effort to conduct mass deportation of many of the undocumented who live in this country. The focus of this press briefing is going to be on the economic impact. But we are not blind to the fact that there are important questions regarding the legality, the operations, the morality, measures to protect communities, blue state reaction, red state reaction. So this is, in my view, sadly, going to be an area rich in conversation for at least weeks, months, if not years to come. And so we will be launching a series of press briefings with experts. But today the focus is going to be on the economics, the economic impact of mass removals. And these are changes that don't recognize legal status. So the changes that are about to come to the country's economic health will be felt by all. Luckily, we have three terrific experts today to walk us through what some of the implications are going to be for these future policies. The first person that will be speaking is Robert Lynch. Robert is a professor of economics at Washington College. Next will be Phillip Connor. Phillip is a senior demographer with Forward.us, and he'll be providing important insights into the segment of population that are likely to be the most impacted. And then third, excuse me, is Stuart Anderson, and Stuart Anderson is executive director of the National Foundation for American Policy. Treat to have you all with us. Let's jump right in. Robert, could you kick us off?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. For the past 15, 20 years, I've been studying the implications of both immigration and deportation on the American economy, specifically on jobs, wages, prices, and economic growth, and also government finances. Recently, my co-author Michael Ettlinger and I wrote a couple of reviews of economic studies that specifically measured the economic effects of past mass deportations and studies that estimated the economic impacts of potential future mass deportations. Let me briefly summarize our findings, turning first to the effects of past mass deportations. 4 of these mass deportation episodes in U.S. history have been carefully studied by economists. There are others, but not all of them have been carefully studied by economists. The first took place in the 1930s, the second in the 1960s, the third ran from 2008 through 2014, and the fourth followed from a set of strict anti-immigration laws that were enacted in Arizona in 2007, 2008, and which caused Arizona to lose an estimated 40% of its unauthorized immigrants. One of the things that's fascinating is that in each of these episodes, politicians and proponents of the deportations asserted that the policy would create jobs for American workers, raise their wages, and grow the economy. But in each case, jobs for American workers did not materialize. Their wages did not go up, and the economy did not grow. Let's take the 2 most recent cases, which in many ways are most relevant for us because they're close in proximity in terms of time. In the Secure Communities program that started under President Bush and continued under President Obama, that ran from 2008 to 2014, it led to the deportation of 454,000 unauthorized immigrants across the countries. And studies found that the deportations actually reduced the employment of US-born workers and reduced their hourly wages. In the case of Arizona, the departure of 40% of their undocumented workers between 2008 and all the way through to 2015 reduced Arizona's economy by about 2 percentage points each year between 2008 and 2015, and decreased total employment by about 2.5%. Ironically, given the program's intent in Arizona, low-educated, as non-college educated white men were among the hardest hit, experiencing a lower employment rate on the order of about 4%. All right, what about the potential effects, economic effects of future mass deportations? Several studies have estimated this, and they've estimated that the economy of the United States would shrink between about 2.6% and as much as 6.8%. And just to put that in dollar terms, that's on the order of $1 to $2 trillion per year eventually. And they found that government finances would suffer from the loss of at least $100 billion in tax revenue, and inflation would go up possibly as much as 3 additional percentage points. So if you think about it today, where the inflation rate is around 2.5%, it might jump up to 5 or 5.5%. So an important question that we should all be asking ourselves is, why do these negative economic effects follow from the mass deportation of unauthorized immigrants? Well, there are several reasons, but I'm going to, just for time reasons, I'm just going to focus on 2 of them. One, which has been sadly very much neglected in the discussion, but it's what economists refer to as the demand side effect. And how does that work? If you remove from the American economy 11 million people, 8 million of whom work and earn hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and spend hundreds of billions, I should say, of dollars on food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and thousands of other goods and services, then what will happen is American businesses will find that their sales are declining by hundreds of billions of dollars. Businesses will then cut back on what they produce. They will lay off workers or lower wages or some combination of the two, and the economy will shrink. The second reason has to do with the notion of whether unauthorized immigrants are substitutes or complements for American workers. And let me explain. That's a little bit more technical and more complicated. But the proponents of mass deportation argue that unauthorized workers are what they call close substitutes for American workers. That is, unauthorized immigrants, they claim, have skills, education, and training, and willingness to work that are very similar to those of non-college educated American workers. So that if we were to deport 8 million of these workers, then we will free up jobs for 8 million low-skilled American workers. But there's several problems with that. First of all, as many Americans, I think, already realize, that among the undocumented population, a lot of them are doing jobs that Americans are not really willing to do. We can think about, if we deported over 20% of all the farm workers in America, do you really think that an unemployed factory worker in Tennessee or a construction worker in New Hampshire is going to move to the Central Valley of California to pick fruits and vegetables, or to Texas to pick cotton, or Georgia to pick peanuts, or Florida to work in sugar farms? That the research shows in the past that has never happened, right? It is inconceivable that would happen. And we see the same thing with other professions, like in child care and elder care, and many in construction as well. But in addition to that, what economists have realized in the last 20 years is that for the most part, unauthorized immigrants are not close substitutes for American workers. They have different skills, different ability to work, different willingness to work. And in fact, often they are not in competition with American workers, but they work cooperatively with American workers, increasing each other's productivity and their wages, and creating more jobs and growing the economy for everyone. And the bottom line is that research shows that the mass deportations in the past have not succeeded in growing the economy. In fact, it's the opposite. They've caused the U.S. economy to contract, jobs for American workers to decline, wages to decline. And the idea that mass deportation will help American citizens in the future is likely an illusion. It has not worked in the past, and it is very unlikely to work in the future. Thank you. I'll stop there. Angie.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Phillip Connor. He's a senior demographer with Forward.us. Phillip?
Thanks, Angie, and great to be here. Welcome, everyone. Eliminating critical protections like temporary protected status and deferred action for childhood arrivals, known as DACA, combined with the deportation of millions of others undocumented immigrants, would devastate local economies and lead to significant job losses in essential industries such as healthcare and manufacturing and agriculture. All our communities and economy thrive when immigrants with deep ties to the US can live and work with security and stability. Now is the time to pursue real policy solutions that address our immigration challenges without comprising our economy or betraying our nation's core values. I want to make sure we kind of list that up at the top of kind of the challenges that would exist in our economy and also our populations if these mass deportation threats were to actually occur. And so I want to be clear, though, off the top that I'm a demographer and not an economist. And although demography has very important economic implications, I'll get to those in just 1 or 2 minutes. But to be clear, a mass deportation plan is a mass family separation plan. Trump is promising to start his second term by carrying out the largest mass deportation operation in history, targeting millions of families across every community in the country and ending temporary legal protections, including TPS and programs like DACA already mentioned. And these proposals are expansion of Trump's heinous zero tolerance policy that separated thousands of children from their families at the US-Mexico border several years ago. So just to put it as a matter of perspective, Ford.us calculated the likely number of people that will be in mixed status families or undocumented families come the beginning of 2025. That number is 28 million individuals across the United States, which includes over 20 million Latinos in this country, or roughly 1 in 3 Latinos in America overall. Now, these mass deportation plans, again, have family separation implications and will have severe economic implications, including at state and local government levels. So, for example, not only could there be future costs to states and localities that would now need to care for US citizen children when separated from undocumented parents, so think of those costs, but we also know that the loss of an undocumented parent would significantly increase the number of children living in poverty, US citizen children living in poverty. So in the Coalition for the American Dream report that I assisted in authoring, I calculated that 120,000 additional US citizen children would be forced into poverty if their DACA recipient parent was no longer in the workforce due to deportation or loss of work authorization. And that's only one important and critical part, but a small part of the total undocumented population that live in mixed status families. Most long-term undocumented immigrants have lived in the US for decades and have contributed to the US economy since they were in their early 20s. With most now in their late 30s and early 40s. But if we look to those protections like DACA recipients, again, as another example, if DACA recipients were forced to stop contributing to the US economy, that would result, again, as one programmatic example, 440,000 direct job losses just for DACA recipients alone, which include an estimated loss of 37,000 healthcare professionals, as many as 51,000 jobs in manufacturing. And many DACA recipients are business owners. And so if they no longer are able to work or are deported, as many as 168,000 US jobs in those DACA instances would be lost. I do want to take just a moment to look at the economic impacts of restricting future immigration, just because we keep this all in perspective here. So to be clear, the US working age population today is only growing through immigration. Let me say that again. The working age population today is only growing through immigration. And if we return to the low levels of immigration seen during the first Trump administration, we would not see the growing workforce we need to sustain labor demands. As our own research at Ford.us has shown, reducing immigration during the first Trump administration left a workforce gap that took several years to refill when we were coming out of the pandemic, exacerbated labor force shortages, and contributed to rising inflation because of that tight labor market. And as further evidence that we worked with in research with George Mason University, we looked at the future and looking just at 2040, which, friends, is not really far off from now, only 15 years, moving back to lower immigration flows for the years ahead, as proposed in some of the future Trump administration's plans. Per capita GDP would shockingly be lower than if immigration were allowed to continue at more normal and sustained levels. Lower immigration would lead to a GDP per capita of 80,000 in today's US dollars, compared with a much higher 96,000 in 2040 with the level of immigration we need to meet workforce demands of an aging population. So in sum, mass deportation is a mass family separation plan. And so we need to continue to look at these kind of family implications that have also important economic impacts. We also look at our workforce demographics as well, the fact we are an aging population. And this is very critical when we look at not just the movement of people out of the country for any mass deportation plan, but also for any new additional immigrants that may be coming in the years ahead. I'll send it back over to you, Angie.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was terrific. Our next and final speaker is Stuart Anderson. Stuart is the Executive Director of the National, oh gosh, I just lost it, Foundation. I was going to say Federation, but I knew that wasn't right, for American Policy. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, thanks, Angie. And it's great that we're going to be focusing on legal immigration because so much political attention in particular ends up getting focused at the border that it's easy to forget that usually over 1 million people each year immigrate through the legal immigration system. And that's one reason why in the past, in particular, people who want to restrict immigration have really focused on the legal immigration system because they assume that's going to be a lot easier to get a handle on. And that happened during the first Trump administration. And I think if you want to look at what might happen in a second Trump administration, I think it is the best way to do that is to look at what happened in the first Trump administration. And legal immigration was actually restricted in several ways, particularly from cutting refugee admissions down to historically low levels. The well-known what has been called the Muslim travel ban, and also directions to consular affairs on public charge as well. And there are also several policies that they hope to implement in a wide-ranging way, such as public charge and a health insurance mandate that was not put into effect for very long because it was blocked in court. Now, we estimated from actually looking at the number for FY 2016 that if the legal immigration numbers had continued just at that level for 4 years during the Trump administration, you would have had approximately 770,000 more people immigrate legally to the United States over the course of that 4 years. Now, some of that did come in the second part of FY 2020 because of COVID. On the other hand, it's not like the Trump administration tried to accommodate people. In fact, there were 2 executive actions using 212F, presidential authority, that actually blocked the entry of almost all categories of immigration and almost all categories of work visa holders. So whether we will see that exact policy remains to be seen, but you're almost guaranteed to have a number of the policies that were at least attempted the first time around be tried again. Now, our organization had a couple of papers that are also relevant on this policy. Economist Madeline Zavodny looked at what happened to real GDP growth or gross domestic product growth in 2022 as a result of the Trump administration policies over the previous years, as well as some impact of COVID, and found that the real GDP growth could have been as high as 3.2% in 2022, but instead was only 1.9%. So really that gap between the two, it could have been up to as high as 3.2%. And that's because labor force growth is an important part of economic growth. And it's very difficult to have an economy grow when you don't have labor force growth. And we had another study that came out recently where we looked at labor force growth, and we found that in the last 5 years, 88% of US labor force growth has been due to immigrants. In fact, if you look at the past 5 years, if it wasn't for immigrants and their children, including their US-born children, you would have had actually no labor force growth in the United States. And it's very hard to have improving standard of living if you just don't have any labor force growth over the course of a period of years. And in fact, we looked at going out to 2052. By 2052 or sooner, you are very likely to see the only source of labor force growth will be immigration to the United States. And that's just a reflection of the aging population. And those numbers, of course, could change, and all these things could happen sooner if you end up having bigger cuts to immigration. So to conclude, I think what we're going to see in the second Trump administration is a continuation of attempts that started in the first administration to cut legal immigration through various means. We're likely to be surprised at some of the actions, but I think the overall goal will be to have less legal immigration, and over the course of the coming decades, that could even be felt. But in the more immediate term, you're likely to see a lot of disappointed Americans who are looking to sponsor loved ones. You're going to see some disappointed employers, and you're very likely to see American consumers not able to get some of the services they want to be provided, being provided for them.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you, gentlemen, for your terrific presentations. We'll take questions now. I should have said this at the beginning, so very sorry. That you can either use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or you can raise your hand. I see that there is one that is very lengthy from Ralph, but let me see if we've got any others just before we go to that one. Okay. Gentlemen, you may want to open up the chat. Aside from agriculture, what are the other industries where they work, and which regions of the country would experience the most significant impacts because of mass deportation, and why? This gentleman works in the South, in Alabama, and he's curious, I think, about Alabama. Raphael, if you're on and you, I think you've been admitted. Raphael?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having this, and I'm glad this mic is working. My question is really on, I know there's been a lot of focus on the denaturalization. It's really rhetoric so far. How possible do you think a bigger denaturalization program is, and how much of economic effect would that have against maybe, like, giving out fewer green cards every year?
Well, I think it's safe to assume that there will not be an attempt to denaturalize Elon Musk. I think we can probably guess that one. But I mean, I think, you could end up having a chilling effect on people, and that would be possible. But I think that it's a really good question, because they kind of just got started on denaturalization efforts, and it's certainly something that can continue. But I can't imagine the numbers would be as big as you might see in terms of comparison to mass deportation, or simply just blocking green card categories, such as blocking the diversity category, for example, which would be like 50,000 people a year.
All right, let's see. We also have in the Q&A, are historically blue states like Maryland at risk of family separation as well? Does the same apply to the workforce demands? So I think the question is really getting at whether we're going to see differences in the application of some of the mass deportation efforts, depending on the political leaning of the state. I don't know if, gentlemen, if you have a sense of that.
I can talk briefly about that. So in terms of and also responding to the earlier question about the different industries and parts of the country that would be most affected. But in terms of for example, of the unauthorized immigrants, we know that they are more concentrated in several states like California, Texas, New York, New Jersey, and those states, Florida, those are the ones that are most likely to have the most significant economic impact. But obviously, if there's slowdown in those economies, there are going to be slowdowns elsewhere. And then within industries, as I think Phillip was mentioning earlier, the main concentrations are in farming, manufacturing and construction, and also we see it quite a bit in a lot of service activities, for example, in childcare, elder care, and hospital entertainment, hospitals, but also hotels, restaurants, bars. Those are the main areas that are affected by, at least by the undocumented, unauthorized immigrants.
Yeah, and if I can pipe in there, Angie, for just a moment. Thanks, Robert. We actually looked at this in terms of the undocumented population nationwide. And we look at some very specific occupations, just kind of put some numbers around what Robert was saying. Basically, 13% of construction workers are undocumented nationwide, 13% of building and grounds maintenance workers, 7% of food and preparation services, 7% of manufacturing and production. Now, that's the total undocumented population of 11 million plus. But if we were to think of just a little more critically about the promise to revoke temporary protected status, or those that maybe have entered on parole in just the recent years, we know that it would be hundreds of thousands of people almost immediately having no access to work authorization, of which those employers are relying on that work authorization to have those individuals work in their enterprises. And so we would see the effects, as Robert mentioned, in some very critical key states like Florida, Texas, California, but also others that have had recent movements of immigrants in just recent years, like New York City, for example, and Denver. And so we would see these localized impacts being very severe in just a matter of months if the promises that have been put forward actually come to be.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right, I just want to emphasize that we'd love to take questions from the media first. I know there are a number of colleagues and non-media folks on, but we'll try to take any questions from the press first. And I also believe that the last question was suggesting maybe that we'll see a difference depending on blue state or red state, what the impact might be, or the likelihood that ICE can be as successful in some of those states. Great question. And as I said at the top of the call, that and so many other implications and ramifications of these policies, we're going to explore in future webinars. To some extent, we need to see how these policies play out, and then we'll have a clearer picture about some of these other important questions. So I see that, Sydney, you have a question in the Q&A. How long would it take? For the American economy to recover from the hits it will take from mass deportations on this level? Would it be possible to fix the economy without programs to introduce higher levels of immigration or immigrant workers like the Bracetto program from the 40s, 60s? So how long will it take to recover, I think is the question.
So I'll just quickly mention it. As you suggested just now, Angie, that we don't know for sure how the programs are going to be implemented, which means that we can't say with any high degree of certainty, are they going to remove 11 million, 5 million. And as Stuart was talking about, it's not just the unauthorized, it's also maybe restrictions on legal immigration as well. And we don't know the specifics of those programs. So in that sense, it's very difficult to forecast how long it would take to recover from those things. But generally speaking, I would point out that it's not so much that you would have a recovery, you would probably have an economy that would move to a longer term, lower level of growth and of overall size. So it's not that we're just going to go down and then come back up. It will go down, we'll come back up when it starts to adjust, but then it'll be at a lower level. Instead of growing this way, it'll grow that way, And the problem is that, as Stuart mentioned, historically, we have had a growing labor force almost throughout all of American history that has contributed to the fast, rapid economic growth in the United States. And if you remove a major source of that labor growth, whether it's undocumented workers or legal immigrants, you're going to likely slow down the overall growth rate. And it's just as an odd point, if you hear about your friend or neighbor who's having a child, or is maybe a teenager who's graduated from high school, we don't immediately think, oh my goodness, we're going to lose jobs. No, this has historically always happened, and it's grown the economy. But somehow we don't seem to understand that when it comes to legal immigrants and often unauthorized immigrants. And that is, of course, not putting aside the cultural and moral and other ethical issues. I'm just talking about from the economic perspective.
Sure, super helpful. All right, let me go to the next question. It was in the chat. Yvette Fernandez asks, Can you talk a little bit more on the affected states and cities? Construction and hospitality are big in Las Vegas, Nevada. How would this affect tourism, hospitality, affordable housing, similar situations in different industries in other cities? Can you elaborate? Thank you.
I can try to pipe in here, Angela, on this. So we actually did a study with George Mason University researchers a little while back when we looked at the period around the pandemic. As we know, as an example, that people started shifting within the United States. Americans started moving to places that they had maybe not lived before because now they were remote workers and they had the capacity to do that. And what was interesting is that the level of inflation that occurred at these local levels, because all of a sudden there were new demands for new labor, for services that these new residents were looking for, were not being able to be met. And typically when you have these kind of shifts within the demographics of a country, the geography and the economy, immigrants have been the ones often to fill some of these roles. And that didn't happen during the pandemic because we stopped immigration, and also because they're just actually we reduced immigration for a few years towards the end of the Trump administration, and so they were unavailable to actually meet those needs. And so what has happened? We all lived it. Inflation rose, okay, and then it took some time. Immigration, continued as well, but then was able to kind of alleviate that inflation that went over time because of a loosening of the tight labor market. So we have seen this play out before, and I want to kind of make that point, is the fact that the math just doesn't add up. And again, I'm a demographer. My kids make fun of me. I subtract, divide, multiply. I don't do anything really elaborate here, but the math just doesn't work out on this score. And so we need to just kind of think through that. We've lived it before. Do we really want to live that experience again? And yeah, so this is just something to keep in mind as we kind of look at these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I may just very quickly add to Philip's point, is that numerous researchers have looked at the effects of the dramatic slowdown in immigration that occurred. That was exacerbated, of course, by COVID in 2020, where it affected the entire world. You can see the Federal Reserve has done a number of analyses, and even the chair of the Federal Reserve has acknowledged that the dramatic slowdown in the number of immigrants that took place in 2020 was a major contributor to the labor shortages and therefore rising prices that happened in 2021 and continued into 2022.
Super helpful point, gentlemen. All right, one more question and then we're about to wrap up. So thanks for hanging in there, everybody. Carol Dumas has a question. What would be the impact on production, agriculture, and food processing? So really like a deep dive on that industry. Gentlemen, what do you think?
Again, I'll be happy to jump in. And so what we know is that right now, if you look at in the United States, farm workers, about over 20%, somewhere between 22, 25% of all farm workers are unauthorized immigrants. And another, and unfortunately, I don't remember the exact percentage, are immigrants. So between unauthorized and legal immigration, there are a huge portion of our farm workers. And if you remove the unauthorized, you're going to create huge problems in farming across the United States. And the likely result of that, again, we don't know what will happen exactly, how quickly it will be done, how massively it will be done. But if it's done on a large scale, we're talking about massive shortages of labor at the farm level, which will probably force a number of farmers to shut down altogether, others to cut back on production, and this may create relative shortages in food supplies and therefore rising prices. And that's what we've seen. That's what we saw happen in 2020, 2021, and that's what we're likely to see happening if this is carried out on a mass scale.
Thank you, Robert. And just another point related to that, where you were saying, I don't remember the percentage that are legal or that are undocumented. Inconveniently, undocumented people don't just live together by themselves in their own apartment building. So I'm sure there are a lot of mixed status families. I think, Philip, you made that point. And so it'll be not just the price like at the grocery store, but it's like the notion that entire families will be being removed and the impact that that'll have. All right, gentlemen, I don't believe that there are any other questions, but we've covered a lot in a short period of time. Any final points that you'd like to make?
Well, I would just like to add one other thing, and that is the effect on a lot of women as well. in the United States, a lot of childcare and elder care is being done by immigrants. And what's happening, what we've seen happen when unauthorized immigrants were removed from certain communities, whether it was Boston or other cities, we found that a lot of middle class and upper income women were forced to either quit their jobs to stay home, take care of children and parents, or to cut back on their hours. And that's another way where the unauthorized and legal immigrants are often complementary workers that enable American-born workers to work more, earn more, and be more productive. And so there's a huge effect potentially on women as well.
I would just add that when we think about immigration restrictions, we should really be considering them restrictions on Americans, because what happens is an American may not be able to sponsor their loved one to come join them in America. An American employer may not be able to hire someone that they want to hire that would help grow their business. And an American consumer may not be able to get as just was pointed out, of elder care or daycare or some other service that would really help them, such as helping prevent a 60 or 70 or 80-year-old person going on their roof to try to repair their roof, rather than having someone else who is more suited for that.
Sounds like you're reflecting on a personal recent experience of somebody. Go into that. Thanks very much, Stuart. Gentlemen, any other final words?
Yeah, and I will just add that I think that sometimes we are thinking about a whole level of costs, of course, that might be associated with a mass deportation plan, including the rising prices. But I also want us to kind of keep in mind that there's going to be costs that are going to be developing in terms of state and local costs in their local governments because of the lack of the workforce that would be involved here. So for example, just with DACA as an example, we calculated that if that program were to end and these individuals would no longer have access to work authorization, US state and local governments could lose as much as $150 billion over the next 3 decades. And this would put a fiscal gap within many of these state and local governments that is really would be very difficult to fill otherwise. And so this is not just the cost we think of just in our grocery bill, but also potentially other kind of taxes and tax revenue that are so critical for state and local governments.
All right, thank you, Philip. A sobering prospect of what might be coming. But I'm afraid those are the times that we're living in. And I want to thank you all again. And I also just want to mention that we will be having future webinars on the range of implications of not only the mass removal policies, but other policies as well from the incoming administration. Thank you all very much. And go to America's Voice for any follow-up resources or questions that you have. Thank you. Bye-bye.